committee to look into changes to property tax laws was created by the state budget last year. Last week, it met for the first time. And it comes at an opportune moment for homeowners who may be seeing their property tax bills coming in with huge increases. There are several property tax-related bills that have been proposed, but changing the law is complicated because of how property taxes are tied to school funding and other issues. A critical element is House Bill 920, a 1976 law added to the state constitution in 1980. House Bill 920, also called the millage rollback, was intended to protect homeowners from unvoted tax increases. It says if a property's value goes up, the percentage of tax on it goes down, freezing the dollar amount paid by homeowners so operating levies don't grow as property values increase. While that's good for homeowners, it means Ohio schools get the same amount of money and have to go to the ballot more often with levies. The bills proposed this session include House Bill 1, which would create a flat 2 3/4% state income tax and make major property tax changes. That's been stalled since last April. Another House bill would provide property tax relief for seniors. That's passed the Senate, but there are big changes from the House version. To get an overview of this complex issue and what the committee will be looking at, I sat down with Republican co-chair Senator Bill Blessing. A lot of dueling concerns here. You've got homeowners are concerned about the value of their homes. They're concerned about what they're paying. They're concerned about what they're willing to increase that through levies. Schools, of course, are concerned about whether they can pass levies. If they don't, then cuts at schools can have an effect on homeowners' values. Then you've got businesses who are trying to avoid certain payments to do economic development. How do you address all of these dueling concerns?
That's a lot of questions in one there. So, I mean, just looking at what the actual problem is, you have these reevaluation years, and our biggest counties for the most part, Franklin's one of them, Hamilton's another, are going through that reappraisal process. And, for those looking at houses in the past couple years, certainly through the pandemic, have noticed a skyrocketing housing market where housing has gotten much more expensive than it has in the past, much more quickly. And because of that, the valuations, which are supposed to reflect the true value of homes, have gone up, and consequently, so have property taxes. But it's kind of a misnomer in the sense it's not, even if your home's value went up by 40%, your taxes typically are not going to go up 40%. It's a combination of inside mills, which will grow with inflation, and as well as, if you happen to be in a school district that is on the 20 mil floor, that'll impact it. But there are a number of proposals out there in the General Assembly. House Bill 187, which was a 3-year average that then became a modified homestead exemption bill. There's a 70 under 70 bill in the House. I can't remember the number for that.
That's 263.
263. There's other proposals as well, but I think those are the ones that are trying to address this issue.
So trying to address an immediate concern, though there are many long-term concerns that probably need to be looked at, and that's what the committee that you're part of is going to try to do, though you have a timeline here that you're trying to work within. What is that timeline?
So referring to the Property Tax Valuation Committee, whatever, I can't remember the official name, it probably will have its work wrapped up somewhere between March and June. The idea is that it would do a deep dive in the property taxation system overall.
When you talk about House Bill 187, which was the one to provide some property tax relief for seniors, there have been some changes made. Schools would not be reimbursed except up to about half of that value that's going to be saved by seniors. Is that correct?
For 187 as introduced, or
as it is right now?
So as it is right now, yes. So the way it is right now, that homestead exemption currently is currently constituted. The state funds 100% of that. The state would still continue funding 100% of that, but this modified part of it, so increasing it from 25 to 35,000, as well as expanding it to the middle class, but scaled down, of course, to 75,000, that would be a 50-50 reimbursement. So the locals would do half, the state would do half. The reason for that is that because of these skyrocketing valuations, a lot of the school districts and local governments over time stand to do quite well with the amount of revenue that comes in. So the thought was to do some sort of sharing of the burden, if you will.
On House Bill 187, that one's kind of sitting out there. Are there differences between the House and Senate on how that should proceed?
Absolutely. I think the House would like to continue with the 3-year valuation average, which was the original thrust of the bill. The Senate, I don't want to speak for the Senate generally, though we did, I think, get that out unanimous or close to it. Obviously, we like the homestead exemption. You know, we passed it that way, but there are senators who would like to see the 3-year valuation average. So really it is between, at this point, Huffman and Stevens and, you know, the inner circle and what comes out of conference committee for that.
What's wrong with the 3-year average? I mean, what would happen if that would go forward? And then certainly longer term, that money would eventually come back into play.
Sure. So it gets down to the matter of what got us here and what are we going to do to solve the problem. And I kind of feel like the 3-year average is sort of, you know, putting gasoline onto a fire. And what I mean by that is the real problem here is, yes, taxes are high because valuations are high. Valuations are high because home prices truly are high. So what you want to do is ensure that the housing market doesn't continue to rage, and in fact, it would be nice to see home prices and rents actually fall, which by extension, over time, valuations and then property taxes would then fall. The reason, the two things that can be done in order to do that are increasing the housing supply, because we've had an underbuild since the great financial recession, as well as going after the institutional housing investors. And I think between those two things, that would be the best remedy long-term. Short-term, doing that homestead exemption targets low and middle income seniors on fixed income, who are truly the most vulnerable populations with respect to inflation. The reason why the 3-year valuation average isn't that great of an idea is in the sense that it reduces valuations, and because of that, everybody's property taxes will then go down. But what happens is when you have a fixed amount of housing, really like in the moment, you have more money now chasing the same housing stock. It's just going to inflate housing prices, and then after 3 years, when that 3-year valuation average legislation runs out, because remember, it's temporary, you've made the problem worse, and then boom, you've just jumped back up to true value. And I think that is a major problem.
The property tax burden has shifted dramatically away from business and commercial taxpayers and onto residential and agricultural taxpayers since 1975. Residential property made up 48% of the school's tax base then. Now it's 72%. That's a result of a lot of different factors here, but essentially this has been good for businesses but bad for homeowners and agriculture property owners.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is the result of not just the state, but I think the locals are involved with this too. And you know, I apologize, it just came out this morning. Jim Weicker had an article about this, the number of you know, how abatements are impacting Franklin County. I think Franklin County Auditor Michael Stenziano had some comments on that, what can be done. But overall, what's happening is with these various abatements, Community Reinvestment Act, TIFs, you name it, it's reducing the property tax base. And schools, counties, local political subdivisions, you know, they need X amount of money. You know, if that pie is shrinking, the rate that they have to levy to get the amount of money that they need has to go up. So what's happening is the property tax burden is shifting onto those folks who haven't gotten abatements. And that is another major problem as to why property taxes are so high. And I'm hopeful that that property tax committee will address that, because again, that's the other issue outside of, you know, the housing supply and institutional housing investor issue.
Because certainly tax abatements are local tax abatements, but they are authorized by state law, and Republican lawmakers have been okay with tax abatements on businesses. They've updated the laws recently even.
Yes, and I think that they are going to have to take another look at that. And it's encouraging with that committee. You know, myself, Representative Tom Young, was also concerned about the you know, abatements and exemptions and how they're impacting this. So I'm hopeful that there's a shift in thinking with respect to the amount of exemptions and whatnot that are doled out at the state level, and I certainly know that that's the case at the local level as well.
And to put a number on that, the state says $9.2 billion was exempt from taxation because of abatements offered by local governments, which are authorized by state law. I want to ask you about the institutional investors that you mentioned this. There are a lot of companies, entities that are buying up what is essentially limited housing stock, and how is that affecting what's happening in terms of value, and what can you even do about that? I mean, you can't stop them from buying, can you?
So, well, there's ways to get at that, but yeah, so what's going on is they will target certain neighborhoods. They're typically lower income neighborhoods, as the so-called, or maybe not even that, what you would normally think of as like starter homes at one time, like the small, Cape Cods or ranches and whatnot that were built, 40s, 50s, and 60s. After World War II, and folks in the housing community that try to defend them will say, well, there's such a small percentage overall, in the state. Well, past 3 or 4 years, 20% or more of the purchases have been by these institutional entities. In addition, the neighborhoods that they target them heavily, and they will, outbid anybody that they can trying to get a hold of these properties. And as you can imagine, that massive demand in that concentrated area jacks up the prices of homes in that area, and consequently the valuations. And actually, now that I think about it, that would spill over into, if you happen to be a senior in that community, your valuations are going to go up because of that activity. Now, there are a number of things that I have pushed to try to get at these guys, whether it's Senate Bill 76, which sought to basically say, look, you can only own 50 homes in a single county, and if you do, beyond that, there's a tax on that, such that it would force you then to start selling these homes. The idea was, it was sort of an antitrust in spirit bill that nobody should own that many entities or should own that many homes because of the ill effects that it has on its political economy. And it also shed some light on how they operate with 90 plus LLCs, and nobody can really get an idea who owns what. But I think, going forward, this is going to be an issue that I think the General Assembly is going to have to deal with at some point as they start seeing home ownership rates drop, and what that means for Ohio.
You referenced this earlier, and this gets to specifically what schools are dealing with here. The committee is going to look at the 20 mil floor, which is really complicated for people to understand, but basically it would restrict the revenue growth for districts that are at the floor, and about half of those districts are poor districts. So won't this just mean more levies that they will have trouble, if not very, very difficult, almost impossible to pass?
So if we lowered the floor, yes, I think that would be very problematic. I don't think there's any will in the legislature for that. And the reason that a lot of these districts are on the floor is because of these rising valuations that have dropped the effective millage down to that 20 mils. And the reason that 20 mil floor was in place is because of the school funding formula. There was the thinking that it needs to be sort of shared between local and state. You got to pitch in some, we'll pitch in some as well.
And when it comes to what you can do with things like the 20 mil floor and phantom revenue and all these things, House Bill 920, all of these things that are part of the discussion on school funding and property taxes, are you limited on what can be done by the Constitution? And is there a possibility that you're going to have to amend the Constitution to do some of the things you want to do?
No question. That exact question was asked in committee about that, and I think it was Sam Benham with LSC didn't have the greatest answer in terms of what would start butting up against the Constitution and what wouldn't. But no, you're absolutely right. And as you can imagine, trying to do something, legislatively at the same time that you're doing it, you're putting something on the ballot to be put into the Constitution, is a tremendously high bar. And if we were going to do something like that, it would have to have broad bipartisan support, not just in the General Assembly, but amongst Ohioans generally. But the thing is with all of this, that 6 years ago, nobody was really talking about this sort of thing. And it just goes to show you that only because of, sort of the housing market issues, and in this being downstream from that we're hearing about it today. So I really question the need to do really major changes in this, even though it's complicated. That may be, but it does tend to work. It's just because of the housing market that we're in the situation that we are.
And I think a lot of the focus has been on homeowners and what they're paying because they're seeing these big property tax bills come forward. But you've suggested that schools are really losing here potentially twice, not only because there's a funding formula that makes them look wealthier than they are in some respects, but also levies and the difficulty that some districts have in passing levies.
Yeah, so that's that. So I don't have, I asked LSC for some research on that because I don't know to what extent there may be, property tax exemptions that, were somehow not included in the school funding formula. What that means, the school funding formula will look at how wealthy a district is, not just income, but also, your property valuation. But if there's an exemption that's somehow being given but is not included in that, the district is seen as wealthier than they otherwise would be. So what happens is then the state doesn't give them as much money because they're wealthier, but oh, by the way, you're not going to get that local money either because that exemption is in place. And if that sort of thing exists, we definitely need to rectify that. But I don't know that that's going to be it's going to be that big, because if it were, I'd like to think the schools would be screaming at us at this point.
So with your committee trying to wrap up work somewhere between March and June, we're halfway through January right now. So is that a timeline that makes sense? And what are the goals that you're trying to reach anyway?
So I think, at least for me, I can't speak for I think the committee generally, the thought was to do a deeper dive in property taxation and see where, we could get some consensus on some fixes. For me, it is to sort of shed light on the issues that brought us here, which again, were housing, the property tax base erosion, things like that long-term put us on a healthier trajectory.
Is there agreement among the members of the committee that you're on about what the goals are and what the timeline is, what you're trying to put together that will come forward later this year?
Yeah, I think there's some consensus, but not a lot, and or they might have different approaches to accomplish the same thing. But that's to be expected to some degree with different political parties on the committee as well as different philosophies within each political party. But again, I think members are trying to keep an open mind as to, okay, let's hear everybody out, see what we can work on, and then where that leads us going forward.
Bottom line for homeowners, is there relief coming? Are there changes coming in the next few months, or is this just going to be a long-term process where there's going to be a lot of talking about it, but nothing much changes?
Now, there could be. It's to do a broad-based, property tax cut here, I think would actually exacerbate the problem, as I had mentioned before. So I think if we were going to do anything, we were trying to target it towards low and middle income seniors. Again, they're the most vulnerable. But one of the reasons that we decided not to do the 3-year average is because it threw the valuation process into a complete disarray. It wasn't just the Franklin County auditor that had complained about that, but the Warren County auditor as well. So there was bipartisan opposition to that with respect to the auditors throughout the state.
I'm just thinking of school funding and how many years we talked about school funding being unconstitutional. It took how long for the Cupp-Patterson bill to come forward and become this fair school funding formula. And it takes a long time to deal with these complex issues.
That's right. And that's actually another issue with respect to school funding that, you talk to some of the gurus of school funding, like a Mike Sobel, for example. That formula, though it works, does run into problems when you have skyrocketing valuations. So when you think of the school funding formula, the best way to think of it is you have the base cost, which largely is composed of teacher salaries, and then you have the local capacity amount, which is subtracted off of that, and that is based on how wealthy a district is. Well, if your base cost is relatively fixed, and yet your local capacity amount is rising because it's composed 60% of which is composed of property valuation, it's rising, and I think it's actually starting to push more districts into the guarantee. So, this problem isn't just affecting, homeowners and what they're paying on their property taxes, it's greatly impacting, the school funding formula. So there's a lot at stake here for us to get this right.
So far, there's no website for the committee and no date for its next meeting.